Herodotus was born around 484 BC in Halicarnassus, today's Turkey. It is believed that in the year 457, he was perished because he participated in a conspiracy against Persia, which was ruled by Halicarnassus at the time. He traveled through many countries and left valuable writings about the peoples and cultures there. His work History is considered the first authored extensive work in prose in the history of the world. Because of this, Herodotus is considered a founder of historiography. He passed away in 435 BC. Herodotus dedicated a fair amount of his work History to Macedonia. The detailed description that he gives of some segments of the Macedonian life at the time, like the Macedonian homes, the toponyms, and even mentioning some lake fish in Macedonia, indicate that Herodotus really did live in Macedonia for a certain time. Speaking of Herodotus, some parts of his work History are being used by the Greek and pro-Greek authors as proof that the ancient Macedonians, or at least the rulers of the Argedas dynasty to which Philip and Alexander the Great belonged, were allegedly Greek. Let's see what Herodotus wrote on this.
During the reign of Deucalion, Theotis was the country in which the Hellenes dwelt, but under Darius, the son of Helen, they moved to the tract at the base of Ossa and Olympus, which is called Histiotis. Forced to retire from that region by the Cadmeans, they settled under the name of Macedoni in the chain of Pindus. Hence, they once more removed and came to Dreopsis, and from Dreopsis, having entered the Peloponnese in this way, they became known as Dorians.
However, Herodotus contradicts himself later on, as he mentions the Macedonians and the Dorians as two separate nations. While writing about the ethnical origin of the soldiers that participated in the Greek fleet in the defense against Persia, he mentions the Macedonians and the Dorians separately. Here we read,
Now these were the nations who composed the Grecian fleet. From the Peloponnese, the following: the Lacedaemonians with 16 ships, the Corinthians with the same number as at Artemisium, the Ciconians with 15, the Epidaurians with 10, the Trosanians with 5, and the Hermionians with 3. These were Dorians and Macedonians, all of them, except those from Hermia, and had emigrated last from Arrhenius, Pindus, and Dreopis.
The Greek and pro-Greek historians use another episode of Herodotus to back up their claims. It is about the description of the situation before the final battle between the Persians and the Greeks in the 5th century BC, when Alexander I of Macedon, a Macedonian king ruled from 498 to 454 BC, came to the Greek camp to notify the Greeks of the Persian locations, even though he cooperated with them earlier. Here we read,
Alexander, the son of Amyntas, king and leader of the Macedonians, rode up on horseback to the Athenian outposts and desired to speak with the generals.
Further on, Alexander told them the following:
Men of Athens, had I not greatly at heart the common welfare of Greece, I should not have come to tell you. But I am myself a Greek by descent, and I would not willingly see Greece exchange freedom for slavery.
The Greek historiography and propaganda used these writings to prove to the world that the Macedonians were Greeks, or at least that their kings were. And yeah, at a first glance it does seem that way. Alexander declared himself as Greek, so everything is clear. About the Greek origin of the Argead dynasty, a Macedonian dynasty which Philip II and Alexander the Great belonged to, Herodotus wrote the following.
Now that the men of this family are Greeks, sprung from Perdiccas, as they themselves affirm, is a thing which I can declare of my own knowledge. That they are so has been already adjudged by those who managed the Pan-Hellenic contest at Olympia. For when Alexander wished to contend in the games, and had come to Olympia with no other view, the Greeks who were about to run against him would have excluded him from the contest, saying that Greeks only were allowed to contend and not barbarians. But Alexander proved himself to be an Argive, and was distinctly adjudged a Greek, after which he entered the lists for the foot race.
At first glance, it seems that everything is clear here as well. Alexander I declared himself as Greek, and that is why he was accepted to participate in the Greek Olympics, which were strictly Greek only. But if we make a deeper analysis on all these writings by Herodotus, we will see that things are not as simple as they first appear. First of all, we will analyze the statement that Alexander made in the Greek camp, and analyze the historical context it was given in. At the time, the Greek-Persian War was going on, in which Persia battled against the powerful and united Greek forces. Macedonia was led by the previously mentioned Alexander I of Macedon. At the time, Macedonia was militarily weak and economically undeveloped. Macedonia found itself in the middle of this fierce war between those two powerful forces, so Alexander was in a really tight situation. Both Persia and the Greeks could easily conquer the weak Macedonia if they even sensed that it was allying with the opposite side. That is why Alexander made huge efforts to preserve his country. He declared Macedonia as neutral, but secretly sent positive signals to the Persians and the Greeks, just so they can stay out of Macedonia. For example, he married his sister Gygia to the Persian commander Bubarus, and at the same time gave confidential information to the Greeks. Still, on the night of the final battle at Plataea, in 479 BC, Alexander went to the Greek camp and informed them of the position of the Persians, allying himself with the Greeks. He probably estimated that the Greeks will win the battle, even the war, so that is why he went to their camp to gain their trust, especially for the after-war times. It is at that time that he declared himself as a supposed Greek. This thesis about Alexander's false declaration as a Greek, just so he could gain over the Greeks after they defeat Persia, is presented by many present-day historians. One of them is the well-known American historian Dr. Eugene Borza. In his book, Borza rightfully asks several questions. He asks, if Alexander was indeed Greek, wouldn't the Greeks know that in advance? Didn't they know that the Macedonian dynasty was Greek? So why did he have to prove himself? And he wasn't just anyone, he was the king of a neighboring country. The Greeks knew very well who their compatriots are and who aren't, especially in the time of war with the Persians, which was actually an ethnical war. Why was there a need for him to point out his supposed Greek origin? And why didn't any other Greek, Athenian, or Spartan ever prove their Greek origin in front of the other Greeks? Another question comes to mind. Why did the Greeks forbid Alexander I to participate in the Olympics and declared him as a barbarian? If he was Greek, they would have recognized their fellow citizen, and he would not have been declared as a barbarian, a man who does not speak Greek. Borza also writes that Herodotus' story is full of incomprehensible data, which does not make much sense. Such is a claim that Alexander I won the race in the Olympic Games, even though he was too old to do it. After making an analysis of the illogical things inside Herodotus' story about the alleged participation of Alexander in the Olympics, Borza concludes that this story can be ignored. The historians McCann, Howe, and Wells think the same. Referring to Alexander's self-declaration as a Greek before the Battle of Plataea, Borza says that he did this for political reasons, which we already explained. So he writes that insisting on Alexander's Greek origin and Greek ancestors contradicts with Herodotus himself, who mentioned the Thessalians as the first Greeks who fell under Persian reign, confirming that the Macedonians were not a Greek nation. Further on, Dr. Borza concludes that Herodotus and Thucydides both treated the Macedonians as foreigners, a distant nation that lived outside the Greek borders. Borza concludes that Alexander declared himself as Greek simply to integrate himself in the Greek world after the Greeks would win over Persia. He says that the stories of his Greek declaration should be completely ignored, because they represented a view of his propaganda and his final goal, which was, of course, to keep the freedom of his country. The famous American historian Peter Green also shares the opinion about Herodotus' story. Green writes that Alexander was acknowledged as a Greek, but he was strongly opposed by the Greeks who were organizing the Olympic Games. The historian Ernst Bedian gives a similar interpretation about Herodotus' story for the alleged Greek origin of the Arcades. He writes that the influential Greeks made a hard decision admitting Alexander as Greek, which caused harsh protests among the other competitors who rejected Alexander's participation in the Olympics, calling him a barbarian. The German historian Ulrich Wilken writes a similar story. He stated that Alexander I felt sympathy towards the Greeks and wanted to participate in the Olympics, but was rejected as a barbarian because the games were Greek only. This is why he had to prove his origins and was later accepted as a competitor. Since then, Macedonian kings were treated as Hellens, but same as before, their people were treated as barbarians. The historian Arthur Weigel rightfully thinks that it was convenient to the Greeks at the time to acknowledge Alexander I, but just him, not the Macedonians, as Greek, because Macedonia would eventually be needed as an ally against the powerful Persia. If these evidences are not enough, we will again quote Herodotus himself. On one hand, he writes that Alexander I declared himself as Greek. But on the other he writes that the Spartans disqualified Alexander I as a distrusting stranger. Another big evidence that Alexander falsely declared himself as Greek is the fact that he was declared a Philhellene, a friend or sympathizer of the Greeks, by the Greeks when he helped them with information about Persia. They only gave out these titles to foreigners, i.e. non-Greeks, who did good things for Greece. We cannot really understand these things nowadays, but at that time he had to act like that in order to preserve his, at that time weak, country. And he succeeded. He kept Macedonia, which just after several generations conquered all of the Greek and Persian territories. To conclude, even with all the controversial information, we can see even in Herodotus' work clear evidences that the Macedonians were not Greeks.